So, hello, comrades. Today we will continue discussion with Professor Comrade Bruno, and we in the near future will have a 50th anniversary of the historic meeting of the President of the United States and the Chairman Mao. And because today we have new Cold War against China, in this occasion, I would like to congratulate the Polish President Andrzej Duda, who declared that he will go to China. He will go to China to open the Olympic Games in China. In the same time, when the U.S. diplomacy they announced that they will boycott this Olympiad. So maybe the Polish president who presents himself like the most furious anti-communist in the world, he go to China to speak with the leader of the Communist Party of China, and I hope that the Polish president will learn there something. But
Yes.
but we will talk about this complicated relation between China and USA, because this relation is sometimes there are very hot, and we can say about alliance, and sometimes it is very quickly it's changed. For example, in Second World War there was alliance, and few years later there was a war in the Korean peninsula. So Bruno, you can talk.
Yes, of course, this subject is a very complicated one, so I will try to be clear and to talk about most important aspects of this conflict. But of course, we have tons of literature about those issues, and we have to be aware of what we know already, or even sometimes what we don't know, because some information up till now are not always well known. First of all, of course, we have to think that the Communist Party of China appeared, and it was officially recognized, especially by Mao Zedong, as a consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the Bolshevik Revolution made communism appear in China as a real alternative to the not only to the capitalism, but also an alternative to the colonialism, because we have to think about China as a semi-colonial exploited countries at the time. And of course, the third question, which is very important also, and we have to take into account, is that China was a completely backward country at that time, economically speaking. And the main issue for Chinese people, not only for communists, was the development of productive forces. And that's the basic issue. If the Communist Party appeared in China, and if the Russian Revolution was appealing for Chinese, and not only for Chinese, but for all colonial and dominated nations in the world, it is because the strictly nationalist or anti-colonial movements that existed earlier didn't manage to promote a real alternative for all those issues. It means the social issues, it means the backwardness of the economy, and of course the anti-colonial liberation. And that's the reason why the Communist Party was founded in China, and that's the reason why this party began to grow. But all over the 20th century, we can say, the Communist Party of China had to find a line, a political line, which would, in the same time, confront with the colonial issue, with the backwardness issue, and with the task of building a socialist society. And of course, what I'm talking about, these three aspects of the Chinese Revolution, are to a certain extent, and sometimes to a very important extent, contradictory, because as you know, if you want to develop the production, if you want to fight backwardness, some capitalist measures are or can seem at least very positive, very creative, to a certain extent. The second issue is that if you are focusing on anti-colonial fight, which is of course very progressive, you can have tendency to be a little bit more nationalistic than internationalistic. And these issues I'm talking about, if you want to understand the Chinese Revolution from the very beginning up to now, and the differences you find inside the Communist Party of China, and the internal fights we had all over the history of the Communist Party of China, all the contradiction we had within the revolutionary movement and within the Communist Party of China, we observed that the contradiction on focusing on anti-colonial fight, focusing on anti-backwardness fight, or focusing on building a new socialist society, were always, and up till now are always problematic in this party, as in a lot of Communist Party in economically backward countries. And of course, what I'm talking about is directly linked with the class issues, because if we assume that the working class is for sure a progressive class tending towards socialism, of course, it's not always the case with peasant, and the mass of the population of China is peasant. And of course, as we know, peasant can be tempted by the let's say little ownership ideology, not to take into account that the Chinese bourgeoisie was from the very beginning of the modern era divided into wings. What was analyzed by Mao Zedong, two wings. It means the so-called comprador bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie. The comprador bourgeoisie is the bourgeoisie which is directly linked with imperialist interests, and who will collaborate with imperialist aggressors that can change. It can be Japanese aggressors, it can be German aggressors, it can be British aggressors, it can be American imperialists, but basically the comprador bourgeoisie is the bourgeoisie which interests are links with foreign imperialist powers. And you have the national bourgeoisie, which is competing with imperialist bourgeoisie, and because of that, this bourgeoisie is tending to hope for a unified and developing China. And they are on the side of the idea to promote a Chinese national state, which will protect their capitalism against foreign capitalism. But in the same time, they are still capitalists, and they will exploit their own workers, as every capitalist does. And that's the very big question for Chinese revolution. But we have the same situation in other third world countries, the situation what a communist should do in a situation where the working class cannot conquer the power by itself because it's too weak class, and it has to look for allies. On one side, of course, the big mass of peasantry, but as I told you, the peasants have an ideology which is not always tending toward real socialism, toward revolutionary socialism. And you have the national bourgeoisie, which is, let's say, in the middle of the road between revolutionary interests and counter-revolutionary interests. And that's the basic issues we have to take into account to understand the 20th century in China, and of course the evolution and the contradiction within the Chinese Revolution, and the contradiction between Chinese communists, let's say, and imperialist powers or foreign powers. That's one thing we have to take into account. The second thing we have to take into account is, of course, that in every country, the national tradition or the local traditions have to be taken into account. And considering China, which is it's a nation continent. In fact, China, because of its size, because of its numerous population, is by itself not only a nation but a civilization, and a very ancient civilization. In fact, China is the oldest existing state actually existing in the world, with a continuity for much more than 1,000 years. And that's very important to understand, because Chinese, independently from which social class they come from, Chinese are accustomed to think much more collectivistically than, let's say, Western cultures. But they are also counting time not in the same way that we are accustomed to do in the Western world. For them, and you can read documents of the Chinese Communist Party, but if you read documents from other political groups in China now or earlier in the interwar period, that's the same, you will very easily understand that Chinese count things and events not in a short term, but in very long term. Now the official program, I will give this example because it's a good example. The official program of the Chinese Communist Party now, whatever we think about this program, is planning a half-developed socialist country in the middle of the century we just entered in, a developed socialist country at the end of the century, and the beginning of building a communist society for the next century. You cannot imagine in any Western country, United States, France, Poland, even Russia, you cannot imagine a political party which would announce you that their program is leading the country toward a future planned for 100 or 200 years. It's completely impossible. because it doesn't fit to our mentality, to our culture, to our way of looking things. When the Chinese Communist Party is telling that, it doesn't look ridiculous for Chinese, because for Chinese, it's a normal way of understanding. You don't think about the society thinking and taking into account your own destiny, your individual destiny, but you think about the collective destiny of yourself, of your generation, and of later generation. And this has to be taken into account, because when China is deciding a political course, whatever it is on internal issues or international issues and relation, let's say, with the United States, for example, we can, of course, accept or not what they think, but we have to take into account that they don't think in a short term. They think in a long term, and for them, what is important is the decision they take now. What will be their effect in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and more, which is, of course, the complete contrary to what is now capitalist country evolving, because I would say that capitalist country are much more and more short-term oriented. Let's say that in the previous century, capitalist countries were planning their policies for the next 10 years. And now I would say that United States are planning their policies for the next 10 months. So the time is shorter and shorter in bourgeois capitalist society, when the time is longer and longer in China. And we have to take that into account, because it's not only linked with Marxism, it's also linked with the Chinese tradition. But of course, Marxism is important in that to understand that, because as you know, when the scientific socialism began to be invented, let's say, by Marx and Engels, the idea that the revolution will be soon was very frequent. When the Bolshevik took power in Russia, they were hoping that the world revolution will be very quick. Of course, the history tells us that it's not really the case, and it was not really the case. And that's one of the reasons, of course, not the only reason, one of the reasons why the communist movement began to have something like a crisis. And it's explained to a certain extent why a European socialist country collapsed. Of course, it's not the main reason, but it's one of the reasons we have to take into account, that people in Eastern Europe were told that socialism is the future of humankind, but it was more or less accepted as it's the future for the humankind for the next generation. And since the real socialism, the base of an really equal and democratic society were not entirely introduced in socialist countries, a lot of communists began to doubt about Marxism in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, etc., etc. And it's not, it's not. It's very important to understand that one of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons why the Chinese communists or the Vietnamese communists or the Korean communist parties didn't, or the Laotian communist party didn't collapse after at the same moment, we had the collapse of Soviet Union and socialist bloc in Europe, is, among other things, the reason why they look on long-term times, and for them, the fact that socialism was not built in one or two generations, it doesn't really matter, because it can take 10 generations. It's not a problem. They are accustomed to think in terms of long history, long term, and long building of processes. So that when the communist leadership in China is telling to the Chinese people, now we have good relation with some capitalist country, now we have some capitalist exploiters in our countries, but basically we are going forward towards socialism, it doesn't look ridiculous. It would look ridiculous in a European society, and to a certain extent it looked ridiculous even in Russia, because if we remember the NEP policy for communists of Russia at that time, NEP was a setback. I mean, every Bolshevik who accepted the NEP accepted it as a very short-term concession to capitalism, because you couldn't imagine in Russia people telling you, we will have a NEP for the next 1 or 2 generations. And that's one of the reasons. That's not the only reason, but that's the reason why the NEP couldn't be carried on very long, and it lasted very short. But in China, I don't know. Of course, we have to debate about the fact if their policy is a new type of NEP. That's a subject in itself. But anyway, the idea that a policy which is not really communist, which is not even really socialist, can be carried on for let's say midterm, for a couple of decades, is not shocking in itself, because as long as the party is pretending he is leading the country towards socialism and toward anti-imperialism, it's acceptable, because it's on the long term is more important than the short term. And that's the same thing in relation with foreign imperialist powers. If you look in the long term, you can make some compromise with imperialists as soon as you pretend that this compromise will not be eternal, that they are for a couple of years, but a couple of years in China, as I told you, is not 3 or 5 years, it's a little bit more. So for the Chinese, it doesn't look very strange that they can have formally good relation with United States for 10, 20, or even 30 years, if in the same time they know and they are trained to know that the United States are still an enemy, a strategical enemy, an ideological enemy, but of course this enemy the confrontation with this enemy can be pushed in the long term and not in the short term. And that's of course the difference with European history, with European mentality, and we have to take that into account. And it works not only in China, it works in Vietnam, it works in Korea, it works in other socialist countries of Asia, where they think it the same way. Of course, there are differences between the policy we have in Korea or in China or Vietnam, but basically all these three countries or these three societies, they count on long term. And that's the same thing when Vietnam is inviting Kamala Harris in Hanoi. You cannot imagine that for the Vietnamese leadership, they decided to be an ally of the United States for the long term. But of course, they can make compromise, which can be shocking for Europeans because, if you remember the horrors of the Vietnam War, you think if you would be a European, it would be very difficult, for example, to imagine in Poland in the 60s that a Polish leader would invite a former Nazi leader to make compromise with him in Poland. But for Vietnamese, it doesn't really matter. As soon as they understand that the Americans are their enemies, were their enemies during the Vietnam War, that you can do with them now compromise, but strategically you know that they are bastards and enemies, but you take time and you can take advantage for that. So the Chinese behavior are not very different than the Vietnamese or the Korean. The situation of these three countries are different, so they make not always the same policies, but basically they are all planning on long term. And that's something that is very difficult to understand for Westerners, even for Western communists, which are supposed to understand that more easily, since Marxism, if we go to the root of Marxism, Marxism is teaching us that the history of humankind is a very long process, and that the revolutionary processes we have from the very beginning of humankind were not decided in 1 year or 10 years, but were decided in a lot of succeeding generations, with revolution, counter-revolution, reactionary movement, revolutionary movement, and so on and so on. So what I told you now is, I think, very important to understand the general context of Chinese communists, because Chinese communists are Chinese, and we have to take that into account. Then let's think about the real situation of China concerning United States. Of course, United States were enemy of the Chinese people, as all colonial powers in China before, at the end of the 19th century, and of course during the 20th century. With this difference, maybe, that the American imperialism was a little bit more clever than European imperialism, because, as you know, Europeans were trying to create colonies, formal colonies, and the Americans were a little bit clever, because their main tendency was supposedly anti-colonial, but in fact they promoted a new kind of colonialism, which we called the neo-colonialism. So for an average Chinese, comparing with Japanese, comparing with French, comparing with English, comparing with German, and even comparing with Russians at the time of the Tsar, the Americans were seen as less dangerous for a lot of Chinese, because they didn't wanted to create, let's say, American colonies in China. They just, of course, quote, wanted to have open market, and and to neo-colonize China through comprador bourgeoisie, Chinese comprador bourgeoisie, but not sending their troops, not sending their police, and not sending their colonial officers in China. That's an aspect we have to take into account. The second aspect, which is of course obvious, is that as you know, imperialism is not monolithic, and different imperialists exist, and especially in the pre-war period, the pre-Second World War period, and that's obvious that the main enemy, the main imperialist enemy of Chinese people during the 20s and the 30s appeared to be Japanese militarism, which was, of course, directly intervening in China, terrorizing its population. We have to remember that about 20 million Chinese died during the Japanese occupation, which is, of course, still very important. Of course, China is a greater nation demographically than Soviet Union. Soviet Union also lost more or less the same human beings during the Second World War. But even if we take into account the fact that Chinese population is 5 times greater than Soviet Union, still 20 million victims of Japanese aggression is something very important. It is, of course, also quite logical that the Chinese communists during the Second World War would cooperate with the United States, as did all communists in the world fighting against Japanese or German imperialists, Soviet Union, as you know, and other communist party in Europe supported American military effort against a fascist regime. So it's not strange if we observe the same thing in China. What is the problem is that, of course, the American accepted some relation with communists in China against Japanese, because the communists were fighting Japanese in a much more intense way than the Kuomintang, the official Chinese government at that time. But basically, of course, American imperialists were linked with the Kuomintang government for economical interests. So as soon as the Second World War is finishing, as soon as the Japanese imperialist is defeated, it's obvious that the American prefer to have the Kuomintang pro-capitalist and pro-comprador bourgeoisie still in power in China than the communists. And as soon as the civil war began in China after the Second World War, the American would be on the side of Kuomintang. What the best proof of that is that if the American wouldn't have exist and provide the policy of anti-communist policy, all China would have been liberated in 1949, but due to American intervention, indirect and direct intervention, but still intervention, the province of Taiwan, which is purely Chinese, it's not a matter of question. It's obvious that Taiwan is a Chinese province, exactly as other Chinese province, historically, ethnically, culturally. Taiwan is purely Chinese, occupied by Japanese earlier, but still Chinese with some specificity because it's an island, but still it's a Chinese land. And the American gave Kuomintang, Chinese Kuomintang government, the safe haven, I would say, in Taiwan. Without American, Taiwan would have been back to China in 1949. And of course, we can consider this as an act of aggression of the US imperialism up today, that Taiwan is not anymore part of China and Chinese People's Republic. Every Taiwanese knows that without Americans, he would be a normal Chinese citizen, as all Chinese in the mainland. That's obvious. Whatever you think about communists, whatever you think about Kuomintang, it's obvious that the Kuomintang saved their life as a government because of American intervention. So from that time, of course, China couldn't have good relation with United States, especially if we take into account the fact that in Western world, but especially in the United States, you have a strong tradition, as you know, of racism. We know very well the anti-native racism in United States because of the genocide committed against Indians. We know very well the anti-black racism because of slave trade. But we have to take into account that there is a third racism which is very strong in the United States. It's the anti-Asian or anti-yellow racism. If you look back at the American literature, if you look back at the American films, you will say that, as in other European countries, but maybe more in the United States, the prejudice against yellow people, including, of course, Chinese, are very, very deeply rooted. And when the communists seized power in China, for the American, it was a big defeat, because it was not only the fact that they lost a big territory, the Chinese territory. It was not only the fact that the party who took power in China was linked ideologically with the Soviet adversary of the United States, because we were already in the Cold War. It was also because it was the sign that the yellow race, if we talk in Western and especially Anglo-Saxon terms, the yellow race is back, and that this was unacceptable. And that's one of the reasons of the Korean War, because the Americans did defeat Japanese during the Second World War, but they were observing that a new yellow country is emerging with a new ideology, not the nationalism of Japan, but something much more solid because of communism. And this was a challenge for the Americans. You have last year, at the end of the last year, I think it would be good for viewers here to look at that film, because you can look it at YouTube. You have the film, Chinese film, about the Battle of Chongjin. It's with English subtitles, so you have just to look at this film. Of course, it's a film, but this film is very important, I would say, because it shows how the Chinese view the reason of the Korean War. And you have in that film a sequence which is a Mao.
Bruno, could you repeat the title?
The Battle of Chongjin. Battle of Chongjin. I can write it. I don't know if people see.
Okay.
You look at.
Yes. I have it.
And you have it in English with English subtitles, so every viewer can look at it. And I think it's a very good film, because it shows which is the official course of the China now, about history, of course. But what is important is this discussion. What I was talking about is this short discussion between Mao Zedong and Peng Dehuai, which was the general who will lead the Korean War on the Chinese side, along with Koreans, of course. And Mao Zedong is telling him, I don't want war, but this war has to be made because they, the American imperialists, will not respect us as soon as we will not have defeated them in one war, because they can't they look with disdain at the yellow people, and as up to the moment when Chinese will not have won a war with American army, the American will never treat China as an equal partner, as an equal country, as an equal nation, as an equal civilization, as an equal equal human beings, in fact. And that's very important, and that's one of the reasons of the Korean War. The Korean War was not only because of Korea. Of course, it was because of Korea, but not only because of Korea. Because it was a war to maintain the hegemony of the white race in Asia. And even if, of course, the American had on their side their puppet from Japan and South Korea and so on, basically, let's say the roots of independence in Asia were on the side of communists. What in Korea, in China, in Vietnam, and so on, and it is very important. And that's why the Korean War is very important, because it showed to the whole world that Asian nations are back, and that they can have their own path of development, and that they are able to develop not alongside the mainstream path of development invented by Western capitalists, but along their own development. That's one aspect of the thing. The second aspect of the Korean War, which is very important, and we have to understand the, let's say, complexity of the Chinese mentality I told you about earlier, is that Chinese, even when they were not Marxist, but of course, when they are Marxist, it's still easier. They think in a dialectical way, because Chinese culture is much more accustomed to the dialectical way of thinking than Western culture. For the Western world, it took time to observe the world in a dialectical way, and up till now it's not already assimilated, I would say. But in Asian civilization, the dialectical way of thinking is a I would say an old habit, which helped to implement Marxism in Asia, by the way. But and what is important and what is difficult to understand for a Westerners sometimes is also the relation of Chinese communists to Soviet Union and to Stalin, because Chinese look at the world with contradictions, and they understand that contradictions are a normal thing in the world. So it's difficult for a Westerner to understand that in the same time Mao Zedong and Chinese communists were really respecting Stalin as the world leader of the proletariat, as the builder of a strong socialist country, which is called Soviet Union. In the same time, they could think that Stalin was making errors, and that Stalin was the leader of a state that could have some contradiction with the interests of China. It's difficult for us to understand because we are accustomed to the black and white thinking. So we have to think in Europe, I would say in Western world, our natural way of thinking is Stalin is either good, either bad. And we have no choice. We have to choose. Is Stalin a progressive man building socialism, or a dictator which is very bad, and so on and so on? In the Chinese way of thinking, nothing is purely white or purely black. Nothing is purely good or bad, because contradictions are the base of life. And every system, every party, every human being is a mixture of contradictions. And if you take Marxism in the Asian way, it is normal that every communist is inside itself with contradictions he has from the old world, and contradiction he has from the future world he is working for. So Soviet Union, but China also, are not a pure socialist country. Communist Party of China is not a pure communist party, as Soviet Party is not a pure communist party, as Stalin is not a pure communist, as Mao Zedong is not a pure communist. You have no pure communism, because the idea of purity, is a Western idea which was also very developed under Christianity. That you have the pure on one side and the impure on one side. On one side you have God, and on one side you have the devil. But it's not the way of thinking Asian society. So the fact that Stalin is a progressive man, which is leading the socialist community toward brightness, can be accepted. In the same time, where you will find in China contradiction inside the Soviet society. So that's why they were not really deceived when they discovered that Soviet Union was not going the socialist path as they wanted, of course, at the very beginning. And what I'm telling now is important, because the Korean War, and I'm coming back to the Korean War for the Chinese were very important. As I told you, to show to the Western world, to the capitalist world, to the American, that China is back, that the Chinese nation is an equal nation as every nation in the world, that the Chinese path has to be decided in China and not outside, and that China decided to be a socialist country, and that is not to be discussed with any foreign power. But in the same time, it was also very important for Chinese communists to show Soviet Union that they are not junior partners, that they are building a socialist society, which is their own socialism, and that within socialism you have contradiction, and you have contradiction also in Soviet Union, and you have also contradiction in Soviet Party, and you have also contradiction in Stalin, because Stalin is the leader of Communist Party of Soviet Union. He is a Marxist. He is a prominent Marxist. He's a good Marxist, but on the same time, he is the leader of Russia. And Russia has strong traditions which are not progressive, which are coming from the backwardness of Russia. And to a certain extent, Stalin is also the leader of this backwardness, which makes Russia a country tending to have a strong leadership and a strong dominance, and something like a hegemonical relation toward, let's say, little nations surrounding Russia, including China. So the Korean War was also important for Chinese communists to show to Soviet people and Soviet leadership and Stalin that China is not a little yellow country in Asia, which will be, the junior partner of Soviet Union, but that China, the People's Republic of China, is a power because of its because it's a big country with a big population, and that the relation between China and Soviet Union has to be equal. And of course, it's difficult for us to understand because if we take side for Stalin, we would like to think that Stalin was always right. But he was always progressive, and he was never linked with some, let's say, archaic ideas coming from before revolution. But in the Chinese way, and it explains a lot of tensions you had in China after the revolution, after 1949, it's normal that in a revolutionary process, you have archaic structures still existing, archaic mentality, backward mentality still existing, and you'll find them in Stalin as in everything on earth. So Stalin is, and what I'm talking about is important because it's very difficult, for example, for Westerners up till now, and for Marxists who are tending to think of Stalin as a positive stage of socialism. It's difficult to understand that the Chinese always had a very strong respect, and up till now, towards Stalin as a crucial episode of building socialism, and in the same time, they accept that Soviet type of socialism under Stalin was contradictory, as is contradictory the Chinese socialism. Because you find contradiction in Chinese socialism, and it's normal for Chinese to accept that there is contradiction everywhere in the earth, everywhere in life, everywhere in every human individuals, and there are tendencies pushing humankind to progress and tendencies pushing back humankind, even for communists. So the Korean War was very important also because of that, because it was showing to Soviet Union, to the Stalin Soviet Union, that China is a reality that has to be taken into account, not as a junior partner, but as a normal, developing, and in the future developed country. And to a certain extent, of course, the Korean War was a big success on that aspect, because, of course, if we think about Korean War from the Korean point of view, it's a very sad moment, because the country was completely destroyed, and at the very end, Korea is still divided in two, and that's a very important tragedy for the Korean people in the north like in the south. And of course, we have to take that into account. Korean nation as a one nation is up till now living in a tragedy, because the split of Korea in two is a tragedy. So the Korean War for the Korean nation was very important, but still didn't solve the tragedy the Korean people is experiencing up till now. But if you look at the Korean War from the Chinese point of view, it's a complete victory, because it showed to the whole world, especially, of course, to the United States, that China is back, and that China will build the political and social and economical system decided in China by Chinese. And that's the first aspect. The second aspect of the Korean War, which is very important, it showed to the Soviet leadership, including, of course, Stalin, that China is ready to make sacrifice for the defense of socialism and its regime, and it will not lay down in front of imperialism. Of course, some people will tell us, yes, China did fight the Americans in Korea. China helped Vietnamese people to win their war against imperialism, but in the same time, they prepared a reconciliation with the United States when Nixon came to Peking in 1971. But if we take that into account, which is obvious, we have also to think that when Nixon comes to Beijing in 1971, it's not a victory for the United States. Why Nixon comes to China in 1971? He comes to China because Americans are defeated in Vietnam. In fact, Americans are at that moment defeated in Vietnam, and they have to negotiate with somebody, with some country that can help them to go out from the burden of Vietnam War. So when Nixon is coming to Peking or to Beijing in 1971, he is coming as a demanding power the help of the Chinese. And that's one aspect which is important, because when Nixon lands in Beijing airport, he is not the superior to the Chinese, even if at that time the Chinese economy is much less developed, of course, than the United States. But still, when he's landing at the Beijing airport, he is the one who is asking a solution for his state, for his administration, for his government, and the Chinese can help them or not. So that's very important. So if you take this aspect into account in 1971, for the national pride of China, the fact that Nixon is landing in Beijing is that the symbol that China has been recognized not as a junior partner, but as a big element in the world situation, which is also linked with the fact that in the same period, China is back to the United Nations and Taiwan is expelled from the United Nations. That's, of course, one aspect of the thing. The second aspect of the thing is that it's, of course, a complicated issue, but to stress that issue, China did try from 1949 up to the end of the 60s to develop its productive forces and to make out of China a much more developed country. Now we know, of course, that Chinese socialism as a whole during the period 1949-1975 was basically a success because the current success of the Chinese economy, and every objective economist recognized that, that the basic success of the current Chinese economy wouldn't have been possible without the foundation of the economical basis that were carried on by the People's Republic of China from 1949 up to the beginning of the 70s. But in the same times, at the beginning of the 70s, China was still a backward country with some bases, solid economic bases, but still a backward country. And it had to develop new technologies that were in possession, that were the monopoly of the Western imperialist countries. And on this field, the situation of China was not different from the situation of Eastern European socialist countries. In the 70s, Poland, Soviet Union, or China were in front of the same challenge. It means that they built the base for further development, and they became basically developing quite quickly countries, but they still were facing a basic contradiction with Western countries, that they didn't have all the technologies and that they needed for further steps. The Eastern European answers, as you know, Polish, but to a certain extent also Soviet Union, was that we have to make deal with Western capitalists, take debt from a capitalist country, and in this situation, step by step, it was the time of the so-called détente, the socialist country will get rid of their backwardness, and step by step they will develop their economy. Now we know that the strategy decided under Soviet leadership, I would say under Soviet leadership, but carried on by Gierek's Poland, by Kadar's Hungary, in a radical way, or in a less radical way by Soviet Union, was a failure, because basically it led Soviet Union and other socialist countries of Europe toward the path of submitting to Western imperialism. The Chinese decided to go in a way that can seem to be the same, but which is not the same. It means that they decided that on one side they will accept a much, at least apparently, a much more pro-Western policy in diplomatic way, but in the same time, they will reinforce the ideological system they have, so the Communist Party will not be step by step ideologically dissolved under imperialist pressure. And this strategy began under the late Mao Zedong, and of course was later much more developed under Deng Xiaoping, and it created in the West the illusion that China is going to evolve the same way Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary is going. It means step by step the socialism will be dismantled, the Communist Party will be dismantled, and at the very end we will have in China the same evolution we had in Eastern Europe. And that's of course the big error that the Western strategists and the American strategists did, because they didn't understand that the Chinese were much more clever than the Soviet leadership of the time. They were openly much more pro-Western than the Eastern European communists, but in fact, they were still controlling their internal policy, their party organization, so to prevent any Gorbachev-like counter-revolution. I mean, in China, we had an attempt to create this counter-revolution, and we have to remember that if we had Gorbachev in Soviet Union, we had Gorbachev in China. The two general secretary of the Communist Party in the 80s, Hu Yaobang and their Chao Ziyang, were on the Gorbachev line. But they were put in minority in the party, which is the basic difference with Soviet case, where the Gorbachevs were in majority inside the party leadership. And we know the difference. The difference is that at the very end, the Communist Party of Soviet Union collapsed, and the Chinese party didn't collapse. And in 1989, it was very clear, since we had Soviet Union accepting the dismantlement of socialist countries in Europe, and in China we had the so-called Tiananmen coup, which was the occasion for the Chinese leadership to take back the control of the party, to expel Chao Ziyang from the general secretariat of the party, and we have also to think to take that into account, because in Eastern Europe we had at that time two Communist Party leadership who tried to resist. It means the East German, the GDR leadership, and the Romanian leadership. And Honecker, who was the general secretary of the German communists, went to China in 1989 and supported the Chinese policy at the Tiananmen moment, taking a side of China against the so-called perestroika in Soviet Union. Of course, he was isolated in Eastern Europe and couldn't manage to preserve the German Democratic Republic as we know, as Ceausescu couldn't do the same in Romania. But a Romanian and East German example shows us that the Chinese way was observed in Eastern Europe, and that some leaders of communist parties in Eastern Europe understood at that time that China was not going toward Western imperialism, even if in the same time, still in the Western world, we had the impression that China, with its economical reforms, is going the Western way, which now it's obvious it was not the case, and that's very important, because I come back to what I said earlier, that Chinese are looking at things in a very long term, and because they are looking at things at very long term, they were not understood in the West, and they could, let's say, maneuver Western leaders in a way that gave them impression that China is going along their line, and in fact China was not going along their line, because they had a strong long-term vision which was not anti-communist. Of course, we can discuss about the situation of socialism in China, the contradiction of of Chinese society. We can discuss about capitalism in China. All these issues are very difficult to understand. But what we can for sure say is that China, at the very end, up till now, didn't went didn't go the Soviet way, and that the Communist Party of China is not only existing as a symbol, but we have to think about the fact that we have an organization of 95 million people, which is represented in all Chinese enterprises, in all Chinese districts, which are, the cells of Communist Party are all over China, functioning, and they are educating people, and especially educating their members along Marxism-Leninism. I mean, a member of the Communist Party of China must read and give proof that he understood a basic literature of Marxism in a way we have to take into account. It's not only a ritual, it's very important in China, the Marxist education. It's not something superficial, it's something very important. It's something that didn't exist in Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s, where Marxism was a pure ritual reserved for some, let's say, lecturers, but on the everyday life, I would say that the majority of Polish United Workers' Party members, taking, for example, the example of Poland, which is the one I know the best, but more or less the situation was the same in most of Eastern European socialist countries. They never read Marx, Lenin, and other Marxist theoreticians. They were not trained as Marxists. They were just party members with a portrait of Lenin or Marx, but they didn't know what is dialectic, what is dialectic materialism, what are the basic trend of Marxism, and that's the basic difference with Eastern Asian communists. I mean, Chinese, Vietnamese, Koreans are ideologically trained. And when I say that you have 95 million Communist Party members in China, you have 95 million people in China knowing Marxist literature, reading Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong up till now, and that's the very basic difference with what was Eastern Europe in the 80s. So, of course, I know a lot of people will tell you, China is a capitalist country because you have a lot of capitalists, because you have a lot of corruption, because you have a lot of private property, and so on and so on. That's true, at least partly, because China is also a country where there is a very strong public sector. But anyway, the capitalist sector is also very strong. That's right. But ideologically, China is built along a party which is really formed along Marxism. And you cannot say, it's just a question of appearance. Because why the Chinese leadership would want to appear as Marxist if they could do the same as Soviet Union, as Soviet Communist leadership dissolved the party and become normal, let's say normal quote, capitalist. They didn't do this choice. And there is objective reason, and we have to understand why they didn't do this choice, why the Vietnamese didn't do this choice, why the Laotians didn't do this choice, why the Koreans didn't do this choice, and of course outside Asia, why the Cubans didn't do this choice. They could have do this choice, and they would be still in power, as most of nomenclatura is in power in Eastern Europe. So it's not a question of only power. It's a question of also of ideology and long-term vision. I would say that the Chinese communist leadership is convinced that the future of mankind is socialism. And because they are convinced that the future of mankind, of humankind, is socialism, they don't reject it, because for them the current capitalism is something that will be bypassed in the future. But of course, this future can be in one generation, two generation, or 5 generations, but it will be bypassed. And it's a way of thinking we have great difficulty to understand in the West, including Marxists. Now, maybe you have questions, because I opened quite a lot of issues, but there are other issues I didn't touch.
Yes, so there is 4 questions from the chat, and I would like to say something about this Marxism in China. I think that I already said this you and also in this channel, but I would like to repeat that when I was in the museum of Karl Marx in his house in Germany, in Trier,
Clear, yeah.
yes, I was there with my wife. For us, it was like a tourist visit
Yeah,
because
of
it
course.
is in our. It was the beginning of the holiday, and we were traveling to Poland, but we stay in this city a few hours. No, we sleep there. We stayed there and we slept there. We take a hotel room, and first things, of course, we started our visit in this house, in this city, to see the house and museum of Karl Marx.
Yeah.
And there was a few tourists like us, and there was a group of, I don't know, 20 Chinese people with a guide who speak English, and they were very silent. They are listening, they asking question, and in this question it was seen that they knew this all this biography of Karl Marx, all this. They are very. It was something for me very amazing that there are the people, and these people was the all kind of age. The young student, I don't know, 20 years, but also 40 years, 50 years, and all together they were listening the guide, and so I can confirm this. And I makes video from this visit, and there you can find some shots of this Chinese, but I didn't want it to make to going with there. But I was with there because I was listening this guide also because she was very talented.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I will
Yeah, but
read.
if you what you say is very important, because if you observe Chinese touristical groups going to Russia, of course, before the COVID-19, you have very big group of Chinese going out to Russia, because, as you know, Chinese tourists are all over the world, and they are going to France, England, and Russia. When the Chinese group are visiting Russia, they go to sites of the Russian Revolution, like the Smolny Institute in Leningrad, the house where Lenin was. The birth of Lenin in Ulyanovsk. When Chinese tourists are coming in France, sometimes they are going to the house where Lenin was in Paris, and they are going also, of course, to the factory where Chu Enlai and Deng Xiaoping were working at the time of their youth, because Chinese communists were in France, among others. And it's very important, because it shows that a lot of Chinese are very, very, very interested by by revolutionary movement in Russia, in France, or wherever they go. or to the Karl Marx tomb in London. And it's important because it shows that it's living in their mind. It's not a pure ritual. They want to see that because that's their life. Marxism is part of their life. And that's very important because if it's the case, we can discuss, of course, about the fact that is the Chinese Communist Party wrong or right on this field, this field, this field. But we cannot deny that they feel Marxist and their decisions are linked with their interpretation of Marxism, which is very important.
My mother, she lives nearby the Museum of the Polish Jews, Polin. It is in the place of the
Yes.
ex-ghetto of Warsaw.
Yeah.
And when I am in Poland, every time I am seeing the tourists from Israel
Yeah.
every day. So
Yeah.
maybe it is the question of age, but because normally this is the people 15, 16, 17, but it's a totally different situation. They are going, listening music. They are like kids who are.
Yeah.
And this Chinese was like in
It was
school.
not a touristical visit; it was an intellectual visit. Yeah.
Yes. So, okay. There is a fifth question,
Okay.
and I think that these questions are difficult for you, but
Maybe I'm not a specialist for that question, so if I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, so first question. Kazimierz Mijal in his book estimated that in 1995, only 25% of Communist Party of China members was working class. What is the social class structure of Chinese Communist Party now? Second question. What is the percentage of private ownership of enterprise in Chinese economy? Question 3. What are the chances of China-Taiwan reunification now? Question 4. What about Albania? What exactly made them collapse after Enver? And fifth question, what is the procedure of becoming member of Communist Party of China? Probation period, a candidacy period, formal exams, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a lot of questions. Yes, so working class. Yeah, you're right. Workers are the minority of the Communist Party of China because it's logical. China is still a peasant country. Majority of Chinese people are peasants, so the majority of Chinese Communist Party members are peasants. And that's important to know because traditionally peasants are not completely working class minded; they are rather petit bourgeois minded, and that's important. But what is also important to balance what I just said is the fact that, as earlier I said, the ideological formation is very strong in the Communist Party of China. The main issue of Chinese communists now is not the mass peasant membership in the party, I would say. The main issue is the bourgeois who are in the Communist Party. It means the private enterprise owners which are having working people for them and which are objectively exploiting working class up to the beginning of the 20th century. The Communist Party of China didn't accept capitalists inside the Communist Party. Under Jiang Zemin leadership, when Jiang Zemin was the general secretary, they accepted that capitalists can join a communist party under very strict observation, but still it was accepted. Now let's say the experience led the actual leadership of the Communist Party of China to the conclusion that capitalists in the party are a potential danger that has to be taken into account. And that's why Xi Jinping launched a new term inside the party, which is called the auto-revolution, that the party must make every time its own revolution among its own members to be sure that they are fighting for socialism. Of course, this aspect of the question is let's say it's creating in China tensions and opposition. You have what is called in the Communist Party of China the so-called new Maoists, who are fighting against the idea that capitalists can be in the party. So the Communist Party of China is not monolithic. You have something like struggles within the party, and you have a left wing and a right wing, and of course the general secretary is trying always to be in middle of the road between these two links. But the situation is, of course, full of contradiction, and we have not to ignore that. That's an aspect. Concerning the
wait, Bruno. Because of the industrialization, in your opinion, the percentage of growing of the working class in this period of 70 years are growing?
Of course, you have much more workers now in Communist Party of China than you had in 1949. And in fact, in 1949, the workers were a little percentage of the Communist Party, because basically the Communist Party in 1949 was a peasant party fighting for land reform and, of course, national liberation. And that's one of the reasons we had we had very strong tensions in China in the 50s and in the 60s. Let's remember the Great Leap Forward and especially the Cultural Revolution, because we had a very strong trend in the party, assuming that a lot of Communist Party members were too petit bourgeois and had to be re-educated by mass struggle to understand what is Marxism. And of course, Mao Zedong thought in the same way. So the ideological dominance, I would say, in the Communist Party was never completely sure, and still up till now, it's an open question due to the social composition of the party, but of course also its ideological consequences. Now, concerning private enterprise in China, it's difficult to say. Why? Because first of all, as I told, the majority of the population are still peasants, and land in China is state-owned. But peasants are now not living, most of the case. You have some collective farms in China, but the very big majority of land is let's say, I don't know in English how you say, is not owned by peasants, individual peasants, but is prêté. How do you say in English? I forgot the word. You don't. They're not owner of the land. The state is giving them the land to use it for a certain.
Dzierżawią.
Hello?
Dzierżawią.
Yeah, dzierżawią. Yeah, dzierżawione. In Polish, it's dzierżawione. In English, I forgot the word. So the question is: are the peasant, the Chinese peasant, landowner? No, they are not landowner. But on the other side, it's not a collective farming. It's
To lease the land.
yeah, lease. So, and it's important because if we consider Chinese peasant as private, the statistic will be different if we consider them as, let's say, leasing the state land, but still the land is state-owned and not private one. That's for countryside. If we take the example of city, we have three type of ownership, three or more type of ownership in China. We have two very clear type of ownership. It's the public ownership, state enterprise in China, which are more or less 1/3 of Chinese and industrial enterprise are state-owned. And we have more or less 1/3 which are private-owned. And in the middle, the third third is what we call their communal enterprise. It means enterprise which are not belonging to the central state, but we are belonging to the local public institutions, like a commune. It means city administrations or provincial administrations, and this can be considered as a social enterprise, socialized enterprise, in the sense that they are public, but they are not centrally state-owned. They are locally, let's say, public-owned. What is more complicating is the fact that even if we talk about the private sector in China, the private sector in China is sometimes typically capitalist, as it is in the Western countries. Even if, of course, Chinese economy is a planned economy, and that even the private sector depends to a certain way on the decision taken by the central plan office. But what is important also to know is that, for example, the very well-known Huawei enterprise, you know about it. I mean, all the world know about Huawei. Huawei is a private enterprise, but the Huawei management is not the one we find in a, let's say, traditional capitalist enterprise, because Huawei, I don't know in English how you call les actions, actie. In English, I think it's not the word action. It's asset, I think. I have, maybe I will try to find because it's important.
No, actions.
Actions, yeah. The actions of Huawei are equally belonging to all Huawei employees. It means the director, the founder of Huawei, has exactly the same amount of percentage of actions like the workers of Huawei, like the woman who is cleaning the bureaus of Huawei. Every Huawei employee has exactly the same percentage of action, and he cannot sell them. He's owner of this action that are not allowed to be sold. So, in a certain way, we can say that Huawei is a self-managed enterprise, because formally the director of Huawei and the founder of Huawei has equally the same voice to the administration council of Huawei as the employee, as each employee of the firm. Of course, if we understand the Chinese culture, it's not exactly that. It would be too optimistic to tell that, because in the Chinese culture, the traditional Chinese culture, the founder is always respected. It's very old Confucian tradition, and of course, when there is the reunion of the board, the administrative board of Huawei, the founder of Huawei, when he tells something, he doesn't need to have the formal action to push his decision. He has what we can say the intellectual legitimacy to force his decision, even if formally he's equal to every employee of his enterprise. But still, the fact that Huawei doesn't function exactly the same way as a normal capitalist society enterprise, where you have action, you sell action, and you change your action depending on your own individual decision, is showing that even Chinese capitalism is not always functioning exactly the same way as a normal, let's say, capitalist society and a normal capitalist enterprise is functioning in the Western world. And that's the reason why it's difficult sometimes to you have, that's very good what you have. You see that the union shareholding employee are representing almost the entire property of Huawei, which is of course unimaginable in any capitalist, normal capitalist society. I don't want to make out of Huawei a pure democratic and self-managed enterprise, but still it's not functioning along the let's say traditional, typical capitalist way. Concerning Taiwan, of course, I don't know what will happen, but if you look at the long term, the Taiwan economy is completely linked with the mainland China's economy. So I think that one day or the other, Taiwan will join mainland China. When it will happen, on which form, I of course don't know, but I would say that the economical trend of Asia in general and of China in particular and of Taiwan in locally is pushing Taiwan toward mainland China. How the political compromise will be done, it's difficult to say, but as I told you, Chinese, they have time. They don't force things. So for the Chinese leadership, the question if the Taiwan question will be solved in 5 years or in 50 years is not important. What is important is that the relation, the objective relation between one side of the Taiwan Strait and the other are developing, and that the Taiwanese economy is more and more linked with the Chinese economy, and that's important. Second thing we have to take into account is that in spite of what we hear in our medias, that Taiwan is a democracy and the Taiwanese people wants to be independent and so on and so on. Last month, we had quite a big manifestation in Taipei, with Chinese Republic flags and Chinese People's Republic flag. So the both flag you see just now, the upper one is the Chinese Republic flag, and the down one is the People's Republic of China. And we had a strong manifestation in Taipei with both flags, which are all Chinese, because Chinese Republic was founded in mainland China, not in Taiwan. We had a strong manifestation in Taipei in favor of a step-by-step, but still a step-by-step reunification with China. So a large part of the Taiwan public opinion can be divided on the issue which system, which ideological, which political, which economical system has to be implemented in Taiwan. But the idea that Taiwanese are Chinese and belong to China is still a very strong idea inside Taiwanese society. I mean, the idea that Taiwan is a different nation than China is not at all a consensus in Taiwan. So if we take that into account, mixed with the fact that Taiwanese economy is more and more linked with mainland China economy, I think that Taiwan will be more or earlier or later linked with People's China in one form or another. When will it happen? I don't know. How will it happen? I don't know. But I think that Taiwan is Chinese and will be Chinese, and that. And the American cannot change anything on that way, like the fact that Korea will be reunified one day or another. It's the trend of history, and it doesn't change what Washington is thinking about that. Albanian question is an important.
Wait, Bruno.
Yeah.
There is a comrade here from Shanghai.
Yeah.
I will read what he wrote here.
Yeah.
And there was a question about the Communist Party member. So he wrote, I can read what is his name because it's in Chinese, but you need to be a CPC activist first and be that for more than 1 year. That 1 year is watch period. I am from Shanghai. A city from mainland China, 27 million residents here. And after there is a question, do you think that peasants are majority in CPC? Nowadays, it's almost impossible for you to find any peasants in China now. They are farmers. They all have their own farm, maybe not big. I wanted to read the question of comrade from China who are listening our conversation.
Yeah, it's very important. It's very good. Yeah, what is important, and he's confirming that, is that, you don't get in the Chinese Communist Party just because you want to take the card and you're a member. I mean, to be member, it takes time. And you are, to be member, you have to be consulted. Not only they consult you, but they consult your neighbors, the people who is working in the same place as you, and they are asking what is the opinion of the local society concerning this potential member of the party, and all the time when you are in the party, you are under supervision. And to be a member of Communist Party of China is a decision you don't take alone. The society has to to talk to take opinion on that, and you are observed all the time. I mean, a Communist Party member is always observed what he's doing, what he's evolving, what his political formation is evolving, what his fellow citizens think about him, and so on and so on. So, Communist Party of China is a very serious thing. It's not just you take the card and you're a member and you are becoming a leader. It's not that. And that's very important. It's a very serious thing in China or in other Asian countries like Korea or Vietnam. It's a very serious thing to be a political activist. It's not like it was in Eastern Europe. You took your card and people were not asking you what you are really thinking, what is your political formation, and if your morality is acceptable as a communist or not. So that's something we have to take into account, because of course it's due to Marxism, but it's also due to the very old Confucian tradition that every individual has to be socially conscious and useful. It's not an individualistic society as we know in Western world, even in Eastern Europe, which is not completely Western, but still a little bit Westernized.
And he add here also you need to at least one CPC member to recommend you to be that activist.
Yeah. So it's not belonging to Communist Party is an honor. It's not your decision. It's a honor. I mean, people who honor you accept you are a member of the party, but you have to show that. Of course, I don't want to say it's ideal. I guess it's not, as everything in this world. People are not angels, but basically you have all tools that are used to make party member much more trustful in China than in Western countries where the membership of parties depending on yourself rather than on what society thinks about you. So talking about Albania, I had some contacts with Albanians in the 70s. Later, I didn't have. I have the impression, that Albania was formerly very strictly Stalin-oriented country, but sometimes I had the impression that their choice is not done for basic ideological question, but because of anti-Serb and anti-Yugoslav nationalism, and that they opted for Stalin because Stalin was anti-Tito. They opted for China because China was anti-Tito, and when China become to have better relation with Yugoslavia, they cut relation with China, with Chinese communists. And I have this impression that you have in Albania, you had, of course, a very strict Marxist-Leninist way of thinking, but you have also some nationalistic aspect in the Albanian party. The second thing I would say, it's the same for all Western Europe, as all Western world, and Albania is of course in Eastern Europe, but still rather in the Western world, comparing of course with Eastern Asia. And I think it's important is the fact that we are all in the Western world thinking in the short term or mid-term, but very rarely in the long term. So when it happened that after one or two generations, socialism in Albania, like in other countries, didn't realize that didn't implement a society which would be equally developed as Western countries, it means that socialism failed. Because communists in Europe still are thinking in a 1 generation, 2 generation term, and not in 5 or 10 generation terms, like Asians are much more able to do. And I think it's one reason. The second reason is that the Albanian party, like other communist party put in power in Eastern Europe, they arrived in power at the end of the Second World War, mostly as a national liberation movement, much more than as a class revolution. As soon as the generation of the Second World War vanished to another generation, socialism became just a career, but was not so important as it was for their fathers who fought for communism, because they were fighting against foreign German or Italian occupation, as in Albania. And that's the difference with China, I think, because in China, we had, of course, it's very important, we had the national liberation aspect of the Communist Party, but we had also a very strong peasant revolution, which was a social revolution, which was aimed at the former political social regime, and it was much more. Much stronger than in Eastern Europe, and I think that one of the reason of the collapse of Albanian socialism is the same as the reason of collapse of Yugoslav, Polish, Soviet, and so on socialism. It is that we had a new generation of emerging after the first generation, and the new generation was just judging socialism, comparing to the West, and comparing to the economical, at least formal level of Western countries. And at a certain moment, this new generation, in its mass, became convinced that capitalism works better than socialism, since at least visually, shops in the Western countries were much more plenty than in Eastern countries. After the change of regime, they discovered that the shops were, of course, not empty at all, but that you couldn't pay for things which were in these shops. But before 1989, in Albania, like in other European countries, the impression of the plentiness of shops was very important. What is very important for Albania, I read, but not only, I asked with my colleague in the university, which are working with on Albanian language. They told me that what changed completely the mind of the Albanian people was the fact that up to the beginning of the 80s, the only television you can have in Albania was the Albanian state television. But at the beginning of the 80s, the government decided that people can look for the Italian television, because Italy is very near from Albania. And of course, when they looked, they discovered the Italian television. They discovered, of course, the plentiness, quote, of Italian shops. And of course, it was very important for them because we have to take into account that Albania was formerly under Italian occupation. So they discovered suddenly that the Italian imperialists was richer than they were after 40 years of socialism. Of course, they didn't understand how was functioning the Italian society. They just discovered that the shops were much more
better equipped.
Than the Albanian ones. That's one aspect. The second aspect, which is important in the Albanian case, is that the socialism in Albania, Albania was a very backward country. So Albania at the time of, before the socialist revolution, was a country where you had huge infant mortality. The number of children who were dying just after their birth was very important in Albania, much more important than in other Eastern European countries, which were not very rich, but still not as poor as Albania. One of the first success of the Albanian socialist regime, independently of what we think about this regime, the success of this regime is that it created very quickly a health system that succeeded to save a lot of children from death. And the infant mortality went very, very quickly down. But let's say Albanian parents were accustomed to have a lot of children. The majority of their children were dying before the revolution. After the revolution, they were not dying. So the demographical development of Albania went very, 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 very quick, which is, of course, very positive. But the negative aspect of that is that the production of food didn't went so quickly high as the demographical development of Albania. And at the very end, you had strong shortage because the economy couldn't produce so many food to feed the huge quantity of young Albanians who didn't die. Earlier they would have died. They didn't die, so they had to be fed. And the Albanian economy was not prepared to feed its population growing so fastly, especially if we take into account that first Albania was a backward country, but Albania is basically a mountain country. So the local agriculture, it was of course very difficult it's very difficult to develop agriculture in a country where the majority of the land cannot be exploited. It's exactly the same problem we have in North Korea. North Korea is a mountain country, and only a little part of the country can be exploited for agriculture. The majority of the country cannot be exploited for agriculture because a mountain cannot be exploited for agriculture. And the dilemma of Korea and the dilemma of Albania is how to feed people when you have very few land to feed them, and especially in a situation of a blockade, which is the situation of Korea, as we know, but which was also the situation of Albania, because the quite courageous choices made by Albanian leader, whatever we think about these choices, to have a country which decide by its own which policy will be implemented, made that Albania was boycotted in the West by the imperialist power, was boycotted by Soviet Union because Albania cut relations with Soviet Union in 1956, 1960, and at the very end, Albanian leadership condemned China in the 70s and had not very developed economical relation after that with China. So Albania had no economical partner in the world, and of course, for the agriculture, it was very negative because they had very big difficulty to import food they couldn't produce in their own. And here I'm coming back to the Chinese situation because Albanian was supposedly very strong Marxists, but they were not very good dialecticians. Chinese are much better, much more dialectically oriented than Albanians. So Chinese could understood that they have to take into account contradictions. Albanians had difficulty to take into account contradiction. They were quite puristic, which is the contrary of dialectical way of thinking. It's difficult to think dialectically, but the best example of dialectic is the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Carried on by Soviet Union in 1939. Of course, the agreement with Nazi Germany is morally very disturbing for any pure communist. But it's pure dialectic. I mean, Stalin understood that the contradiction of the imperialist world are such as they are, and that in this situation, Soviet Union has no other choice than to make compromise with Hitler's Germany at that moment, if Soviet Union and communism has to survive. Stalin was a very good dialectician in 1939, and I would say that Enver Hoxha maybe was not a so good dialectician like Stalin, even if he was supposed to be a very good pupil of Stalin. In fact, he was not.
So there is a discussion here with the comrade from China. I will read maybe some of these comments, and I can continue this discussion, but it's already 2 hours, and I think it's time to. So there was a question: what do you think about socialism with Chinese characteristic? And the answer is socialism with Chinese characteristic is a mixed economic system, public sector mainly, private sector as complement. It has the same logic as Mao Zedong thought, the same logic applied to the different situation. The three core of Mao Zedong thought are seeking truth from the fact, being independent and serve the people. Mao was a great person and lots of his thoughts still works today. And there is also a comment of this comrade who asked question about Albania. So Ville 75. Also in Eastern Europe, I have read that the national question was a problem when it was still developing there. It's a shame that they couldn't work things out between Tito, Hoxha, Dimitrov, and others. Yes, I think regarding Marxism, the moral choice won't exactly be the correct one. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I have nothing to add. That's the two observations made by the Chinese comrade and by the one who is talking about Albania. I agree with that.
So officially, our work, our job here is known in the Communist Party of China because the one of the 19.5 million members of Communist Party of China is watching us. I hope, comrade, that you will tell about us of the Chairman Sea. You can uh, we wish to collaborate with officially with Communist Party of China, but we
Yeah.
like equal partners. Uh,
Tiny one, but still equal. Yeah, that's right. That's the
like
communist way of thinking.
ant and elephant.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. I will return to my